The small-town courthouse buzzed with anticipation as people filed in, their murmurs filling the air like a low hum. It was an ordinary day for most, but for Marcus Johnson, it felt anything but normal. This wasn't just another courtroom appearance. It was personal. Marcus had grown up in this town where the streets held memories of his childhood, the schoolyard where he'd played tag, the park bench where he used to sit and dream about the future, and the library where he spent countless hours devouring books that opened doors to worlds far beyond what his surroundings offered. Now, years later, he stood tall in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor as he walked toward the defendant's table. Marcus wasn't just any lawyer. He was known across the state for his sharp mind, unwavering determination, and ability to turn even the toughest cases around. But today, he wasn't here because of his reputation or ambition. He was here because Carla Simmons, a passionate civil rights activist, needed someone who could fight for her when the odds seemed stacked against her. Carla had been arrested during a peaceful protest at the local government building after speaking out against policies she believed disproportionately targeted marginalized communities. The charges were heavy: trespassing, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. But Marcus knew there was more to the story than what the headlines suggested. As Marcus took his seat, he glanced around the room. The gallery was packed, not unusual for a high-profile case, but something about the atmosphere made him uneasy. There were familiar faces, old neighbors, former teachers, and acquaintances from his youth. Some nodded approvingly, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Then there were those whose expressions betrayed skepticism, almost as if they doubted whether Marcus belonged in this space despite his credentials. He shook off the feeling, reminding himself why he was here: to ensure justice prevailed, no matter how daunting the challenge might be. Judge Harold Whitmore entered the courtroom moments later, his presence commanding attention. A man in his late 60s with graying hair and a stern demeanor, Judge Whitmore carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. He adjusted his robe before taking his seat, scanning the room with piercing eyes that seemed to linger longest on Marcus. For a brief moment, their gazes met and Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unnerving about the way the judge looked at him, as though he saw not a skilled attorney ready to argue a case, but merely a black man daring to occupy a position of power. "Let's begin," Judge Whitmore announced curtly, his voice echoing through the chamber. As the prosecution outlined its case, Marcus listened intently, jotting down notes and preparing his strategy. When it came time for introductions, Marcus rose confidently, introducing himself and explaining his role in defending Carla. His tone was professional yet warm, designed to establish rapport with both the judge and the jury. However, Judge Whitmore didn't seem impressed. In fact, he barely concealed his disdain. "Well, Mr. Johnson," Judge Whitmore began, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "I must say, you certainly look different from the usual attorneys we see around here." His words hung in the air, dripping with condescension. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, though they sounded forced, as if people weren't sure whether laughter was appropriate. Marcus stiffened slightly but maintained his composure. He'd encountered prejudice before. It came with the territory. But hearing it so openly expressed in a courtroom stung nonetheless. "I assure you, Your Honor," Marcus replied smoothly, "my qualifications speak for themselves. I'm here to represent my client to the best of my ability and uphold the principles of fairness and justice." His response was measured, intended to diffuse tension rather than escalate it. Still, Judge Whitmore wasn't satisfied. If anything, Marcus's calm demeanor only fueled the judge's apparent need to assert dominance. "You may have fancy degrees from big city schools," Judge Whitmore continued, his voice laced with mockery. "But do you really understand how things work around here? These folks," he gestured vaguely toward the audience, "they don't care about all that legal jargon. They want results." The comment drew more nervous laughter, though many shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus clenched his jaw ever so slightly but kept his expression neutral. He knew better than to rise to the bait. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, determined not to let the judge's words distract him. After all, this wasn't about ego or pride. It was about ensuring Carla received a fair trial, regardless of the obstacles placed in their path. As the proceedings continued, Judge Whitmore's behavior grew increasingly hostile. He interrupted Marcus repeatedly, often cutting him off mid-sentence during opening statements. At one point, when Marcus attempted to introduce key evidence supporting Carla's innocence, the judge waved him away dismissively. "Save it for later, counselor," he snapped. "We don't need to hear every detail right now." Despite the mounting frustration, Marcus refused to let the judge rattle him. Each time Judge Whitmore tried to undermine him, Marcus responded with quiet resolve, choosing his words carefully and ensuring his arguments remained grounded in logic and fact. Yet beneath his composed exterior, a storm brewed. He couldn't ignore the underlying message behind the judge's actions, an attempt to diminish his credibility based solely on his race. By the end of the first day, exhaustion weighed heavily on Marcus's shoulders. As he packed up his briefcase and prepared to leave, he caught sight of Carla sitting quietly beside him. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, though tinged with worry. "Thank you," she whispered softly. "For everything." Marcus nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "We're going to get through this," he promised. "No matter what happens, I won't let anyone silence us." And with that, he stepped out into the fading sunlight, already strategizing his next move. Little did he know, the battle was far from over, and the real surprise was yet to come. The second day of the trial dawned with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the entire courthouse. The air felt thick, as though everyone could sense the tension building between Marcus Johnson and Judge Harold Whitmore. As Marcus walked into the courtroom, his steps were steady, but his mind raced with thoughts of how to navigate the judge's hostility while keeping his focus on defending Carla Simmons. He knew the stakes were high, not just for Carla, but for the broader message her case represented. If he failed, it wouldn't just be a loss for one person. It would reinforce the very system of bias and injustice they were fighting against. Judge Whitmore entered moments later, his expression unchanged from the previous day, cold, dismissive, and radiating authority. His eyes scanned the room before settling briefly on Marcus as if sizing him up once again. For a fleeting moment, Marcus wondered if the judge saw him not as an equal participant in the legal process, but as someone to belittle and intimidate. Still, Marcus pushed those thoughts aside. He had faced prejudice before, and each time he'd channeled it into fuel for his determination. Today would be no different. As the proceedings resumed, the prosecution continued presenting its case, painting Carla as a troublemaker whose actions disrupted public order. Their narrative was heavy-handed, relying more on emotion than evidence. When it was Marcus's turn to cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses, he approached the task methodically, asking pointed questions designed to expose inconsistencies in their testimonies. But every time he tried to make headway, Judge Whitmore intervened, cutting him off or redirecting the conversation in ways that favored the prosecution. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Whitmore interjected during one exchange, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Must we really delve into such trivial details? Surely even you can see that these points are irrelevant." Marcus paused, gripping the edge of the podium to steady himself. Irrelevant? The information he sought was crucial to disproving key elements of the prosecution's case. Yet, instead of arguing further, he nodded politely and moved on, knowing better than to engage in a verbal sparring match with the judge. However, the interruption left him seething inside. Every roadblock placed in his path felt like another attempt to undermine not only his arguments but also his legitimacy as a lawyer. As the morning wore on, Judge Whitmore's behavior became increasingly brazen. During a particularly heated exchange, Marcus objected to a piece of hearsay evidence presented by the prosecution. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "this testimony lacks foundation and should not be admitted under the rules of evidence." "Judge," Whitmore leaned forward, his face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, here we go again," he muttered loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Always hiding behind technicalities, aren't you, Mr. Johnson? Maybe if you spent less time worrying about rules and more time understanding real-world consequences, you'd actually get somewhere." The comment drew scattered laughter from some spectators, though many others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus stood frozen for a split second, his heart pounding in his chest. It took every ounce of self-control not to react. Instead, he forced himself to take a deep breath and respond calmly. With all due respect, Your Honor, the law exists precisely to ensure fairness. Without adherence to its principles, justice cannot be served. Well said, Judge Whitmore replied mockingly, clapping his hands slowly. Perhaps you should write a book about it. I'm sure it would sell well, in certain circles. The remark hit hard, but Marcus refused to let it show. He glanced at Carla, who sat silently beside him, her expression unreadable. She gave him a small nod as if to say, "Keep going. Don't let him win." That silent encouragement steadied Marcus, reminding him why he was there. This wasn't about ego or personal pride. It was about standing up for what was right no matter how difficult the circumstances. Later that afternoon, things escalated further. Marcus called his first witness, a local community organizer who had been present during the protest and could attest to its peaceful nature. As the witness recounted events, Judge Whitmore grew visibly agitated, interrupting repeatedly to challenge the relevance of the testimony. At one point, when the witness described seeing police officers escalate tensions unnecessarily, Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel down hard. "That's enough," he barked. "This is not a platform for airing grievances. Stick to the facts, or I'll hold you in contempt." Marcus rose immediately, his voice firm but respectful. "Your Honor, this testimony directly supports my client's claim that the arrest was unjustified. To silence it would be a miscarriage of justice." Judge Whitmore glared at him, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Careful, Mr. Johnson," he warned. "You're walking a fine line here. One more outburst like that, and I might have to reconsider your role in these proceedings altogether." The threat hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing. Was the judge implying he might remove him from the case entirely? Such a move would be unprecedented and blatantly unethical, but given Judge Whitmore's behavior so far, nothing seemed beyond the realm of possibility. Despite the mounting pressure, Marcus pressed on. He adjusted his strategy, choosing his words carefully and focusing on delivering concise, irrefutable arguments. Each time Judge Whitmore tried to derail him, Marcus found a way to steer the conversation back on track without provoking further conflict. It was exhausting work, requiring immense mental discipline, but Marcus refused to give up. Every objection raised, every question asked, brought them closer to exposing the truth. By the end of the day, the toll of the judge's relentless mockery and interference was evident. Marcus's suit jacket hung loosely on his shoulders and dark circles shadowed his eyes. As he gathered his notes and prepared to leave, he caught sight of Carla waiting for him outside the courtroom. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "I'm sorry you had to deal with all that," she said quietly. "It's not fair." Marcus shook his head, offering her a tired smile. "Life isn't fair, Carla, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting. Tomorrow we'll come back stronger. We'll make sure the truth comes out." As they parted ways, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Judge Whitmore's behavior wasn't just about him. It was about maintaining control, silencing dissent, and preserving a system that thrived on inequality. Marcus knew he couldn't change the entire system overnight, but he could chip away at it, one case at a time. And as he drove home that evening, replaying the day's events in his mind, he made a silent vow. No matter what happened next, he wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The third day of the trial began with an electric tension that seemed to crackle in the air. The courtroom was packed as usual, but there was a different energy this time, an unspoken awareness that something significant might happen. Marcus Johnson arrived early, his mind racing with strategies and possibilities. He had spent the previous night reviewing every detail of the case, poring over documents and rehearsing his arguments. Something about Judge Harold Whitmore's behavior gnawed at him, though. It wasn't just the judge's blatant hostility. It was the calculated way he wielded his power to silence dissent and control the narrative. Marcus knew he needed to find a way to level the playing field, and fast. As the proceedings got underway, the prosecution called its final witness, a police officer who claimed to have witnessed Carla Simmons inciting chaos during the protest. The officer's testimony painted her as aggressive and confrontational, someone who deliberately provoked law enforcement into making arrests. Marcus listened intently, taking meticulous notes, searching for cracks in the story. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he approached the stand with calm determination. "Officer," Marcus began, his voice steady and measured. "You stated earlier that my client shouted instructions to the crowd, urging them to resist arrest. Can you describe exactly what she said?" The officer hesitated, glancing toward the prosecution table before answering. "She told them not to comply with our orders." Marcus raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. "Interesting. Did you record this statement? Do you have any audio or video evidence to support your claim?" "Well, no," the officer admitted, reluctantly. "But I clearly remember her saying it." "I see," Marcus replied, leaning slightly forward. "So, without any corroborating evidence, we're expected to take your word for it. Is that correct?" Before the officer could respond, Judge Whitmore interjected once again. "Mr. Johnson, must we really waste time on these trivialities? The witness has already explained their account. Move along." Marcus clenched his jaw, but nodded politely. "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back to the officer, his tone softening slightly. "Just one more question then. Officer, how many protests have you attended in your career where individuals were arrested for resisting lawful commands?" The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm not sure of the exact number, but quite a few." "And in those instances," Marcus pressed, "did you always rely solely on memory when testifying about what was said?" The officer hesitated again, clearly unsure how to answer. Sensing weakness, Marcus seized the opportunity. "It seems reasonable to conclude, then, that memories can sometimes be unreliable, especially under stressful circumstances like a protest. Would you agree?" The officer muttered something vague, but the damage was done. Marcus allowed himself a small, inward smile. He had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury, chipping away at the prosecution's credibility. Still, he knew this victory was fleeting. Judge Whitmore's interference loomed large, threatening to overshadow even the strongest arguments. Later that afternoon, it was Marcus's turn to call his final witness, a federal investigator named Rachel Meyer. Rachel had been assigned to examine allegations of systemic corruption within the local police department, including reports of excessive force and racial profiling. Her presence alone carried weight, and as she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Marcus introduced her credentials, emphasizing her expertise and the thoroughness of her investigation. "Ms. Meyer," Marcus began, his voice carrying a note of quiet authority, "can you tell us what prompted the federal inquiry into this department's practices?" Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "Certainly. Our investigation stemmed from multiple complaints filed by community members alleging discriminatory treatment, particularly during protests and public demonstrations. We found patterns suggesting officers used disproportionate force against certain groups and fabricated evidence to justify arrests." Her words sent ripples through the gallery, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his face darkening. "Objection," he barked, though technically, he had no standing to object. "This line of questioning is irrelevant to the current case." Marcus didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, if I may, this testimony directly addresses the motivations behind my client's arrest and challenges the credibility of the charges against her." Judge Whitmore glared at him, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "Proceed cautiously, Mr. Johnson. Very cautiously." As Rachel continued her testimony, detailing specific incidents and presenting documented evidence, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. For the first time, Marcus noticed cracks forming in Judge Whitmore's usually impenetrable facade. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between Rachel and Marcus with growing unease. It was clear he hadn't anticipated this turn of events. When Rachel finished speaking, Marcus thanked her and returned to his table, sensing the momentum shifting in their favor. But he wasn't done yet. As he prepared to deliver his closing remarks for the day, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document he'd been saving for the perfect moment. Standing slowly, he addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm but respectful, "before we adjourn, I'd like to present something relevant to both this case and your conduct today." With deliberate precision, he held up a badge identifying him as a special advisor to the U.S. Department of Justice. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom as people craned their necks to get a better look. Judge Whitmore froze, his face draining of color. What is the meaning of this?" he stammered, his authoritative demeanor crumbling. "This badge represents my dual role in this matter," Marcus explained calmly, his eyes locked on the judge. "While I am here to defend my client, I am also tasked with investigating judicial misconduct, specifically allegations of bias and discrimination within this very courthouse." The room erupted into chaos. Spectators whispered furiously among themselves while reporters scrambled to jot down notes. Judge Whitmore sputtered, trying to regain control of the situation, but it was too late. The revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, casting a shadow over everything that had transpired so far. For Marcus, it was a moment of vindication, not for personal pride, but for justice itself. He had endured humiliation, condescension, and outright hostility, all while fighting to ensure fairness for Carla. Now, the tables had turned, and the man who had sought to diminish him was exposed for his own prejudice. As the judge called for a recess, Marcus caught sight of Carla, tears streaming down her face as she mouthed the words "thank you." He gave her a small nod, his heart swelling with resolve. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a step toward dismantling the systemic barriers that had oppressed so many for far too long. And as he walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by whispers of disbelief and admiration, Marcus knew the fight was far from over. But they had struck a blow that would echo far beyond these walls. The revelation of Marcus Johnson's federal badge sent shockwaves through the courthouse, but its impact extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. As the trial recessed for the day, Judge Harold Whitmore retreated to his chambers, visibly shaken. For a man who prided himself on control and authority, this was an unprecedented blow, one that threatened not only his reputation, but also his career. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed like bees around a hive, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. The story quickly spread, sparking debates across the town and eventually making national headlines. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had once been a tense and oppressive environment now buzzed with anticipation. Spectators whispered among themselves, some expressing outrage at the judge's behavior, while others marveled at Marcus's strategic brilliance. Carla Simmons sat quietly beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked at Marcus, with a mixture of gratitude and awe, as if she couldn't quite believe what he had just done. "You didn't tell me," she said softly, her voice trembling. About being a federal advisor." Marcus smiled faintly, his expression calm but weary. "It wasn't something I could share openly. Not until the right moment. But I promise you, Carla, everything I've done has been to ensure justice, not just for you, but for everyone affected by this system." Carla nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. You've given me hope when I thought there was none." As they parted ways for the evening, Marcus felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He knew the battle wasn't over yet. Exposing Judge Whitmore's misconduct was a significant step, but it wouldn't automatically clear Carla's name or dismantle the systemic issues at play. Still, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. For once, the scales of justice seemed to tip slightly in their favor. The next morning, the courthouse was abuzz with activity. Reporters lined the hallways, microphones in hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of Marcus or Judge Whitmore. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. When Judge Whitmore entered, his usual commanding presence was noticeably absent. His face was pale and his movements were stiff as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He avoided eye contact with Marcus, focusing instead on shuffling papers on his desk. When the session began, Judge Whitmore attempted to regain some semblance of authority. "We will proceed with the case," he announced, his voice lacking its usual sharpness. "However, given recent developments, I must recuse myself from further involvement in these proceedings." His words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. Recusal? It was an admission of defeat, a tacit acknowledgement that his impartiality had been compromised. Some spectators exchanged glances, unsure whether to applaud or remain silent. Marcus simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He had expected this outcome, but hearing it confirmed was still surreal. A replacement judge was appointed, a seasoned jurist known for her fairness and integrity. Judge Evelyn Carter wasted no time, asserting her authority, calling both sides to order and emphasizing the importance of adhering to legal principles. Under her watchful eye, the trial resumed with renewed focus. Gone were the interruptions and dismissive remarks. Instead, the arguments unfolded smoothly, guided by logic and evidence. With Judge Carter presiding, Marcus felt emboldened to push harder. He called additional witnesses, including community members who testified about the peaceful nature of the protest and the disproportionate response from law enforcement. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of systemic injustice, bolstering Carla's defense. By the end of the day, the prosecution's case appeared increasingly fragile, resting on shaky foundations of hearsay and bias, but the reckoning wasn't limited to the courtroom. News of Judge Whitmore's misconduct spread rapidly, igniting conversations about accountability and reform. Local activists organized rallies, demanding transparency and changes within the judicial system. Social media lit up with hashtags supporting Carla and condemning the judge's actions. Even national news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the fight against institutional racism. Amid the chaos, Judge Whitmore faced mounting pressure. Calls for his resignation grew louder, with public officials and civil rights organizations joining the chorus. Investigations into his past rulings revealed troubling patterns of bias, raising questions about how long such behavior had gone unchecked. Facing scrutiny from all sides, Judge Whitmore issued a public statement, claiming that his actions during the trial were misinterpreted and insisting he had always acted in good faith. But few believed him. His attempts to salvage his image fell flat, drowned out by the overwhelming tide of criticism. For Marcus, the situation was bittersweet. On one hand, exposing Judge Whitmore's misconduct validated his efforts and brought much-needed attention to systemic issues. On the other hand, it highlighted just how deeply entrenched those problems were. As he walked through the streets of his hometown, he noticed people looking at him differently, some with admiration, others with cautious optimism. Strangers approached him to express gratitude, sharing their own stories of discrimination and injustice. Each encounter reinforced his belief that change was possible, even if it required relentless effort. By the end of the week, Judge Whitmore was placed on administrative leave pending a formal ethics investigation. The charges against Carla were dismissed due to lack of credible evidence, marking a hard-fought victory for her and her supporters. Outside the courthouse, Carla embraced Marcus, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered. "You gave me my life back." Marcus shook his head gently. "No, Carla, we did it. This wasn't just my fight. It was yours too. And it's a fight we'll keep fighting together." As the dust settled, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey so far. The trial had tested his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to confront not only external prejudice, but also his own doubts and fears. Yet, through it all, he had remained steadfast, driven by a deep-seated commitment to justice. Now standing on the brink of a new chapter, he realized that this victory was more than just a personal triumph. It was a beacon of hope for countless others who had long been silenced. In the days that followed, Marcus became a symbol of resilience and courage. Invitations poured in for interviews, panel discussions, and speaking engagements. But he chose to stay grounded, focusing on the work that mattered most. He partnered with local organizations to host workshops on legal rights and advocacy, empowering community members to stand up against injustice. He mentored young aspiring lawyers, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to pursue careers rooted in integrity and compassion. Though the road ahead remained challenging, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle against systemic racism was far from over, but every small victory brought them closer to a future where fairness and equality weren't exceptions. They were the norm. And as he stood before a group of eager students in a makeshift classroom, ready to inspire the next generation of changemakers, Marcus knew that the fight would continue, one step at a time. The aftermath of the trial rippled through the small town like waves on a pond, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen. For Marcus Johnson, the victory was bittersweet. While he had successfully defended Carla Simmons and exposed Judge Harold Whitmore's misconduct, the scars left by systemic racism ran deep. The case wasn't just about one person or one courtroom, it was a reflection of broader struggles that many faced daily. And as Marcus walked through the streets of his hometown, he realized that this fight was far from over. It was merely the beginning of something bigger. Carla's acquittal sparked a wave of hope among marginalized communities. People who had once felt powerless now believed they could stand up to injustice without fear of being silenced. Community meetings became standing-room-only events, with residents eager to discuss how they could push for lasting change. Activists organized rallies, workshops, and educational programs, determined to keep the momentum going. Carla herself emerged as a vocal advocate, sharing her story at town halls and grassroots gatherings. Her courage inspired others to speak out, creating a groundswell of activism that hadn't been seen in years. Marcus played an integral role in nurturing this movement. He didn't seek the spotlight or accolades. He simply wanted to help people understand their rights and empower them to demand accountability. He partnered with local organizations to host free legal clinics, where residents could ask questions and learn how to navigate the often daunting legal system. These sessions weren't just about teaching laws, they were about instilling confidence. Many attendees left feeling more informed and emboldened, knowing they had someone like Marcus in their corner. Word of Marcus's efforts spread quickly, drawing attention not only locally, but also nationally. Journalists wrote profiles highlighting his dual roles as a lawyer and federal advisor, framing him as a champion of justice. Invitations poured in for speaking engagements, panel discussions, and interviews. While some might have relished the opportunity to bask in the limelight, Marcus approached these platforms with humility. He used every chance he got to amplify voices that had long gone unheard, emphasizing that real change came not from individuals, but from collective action. One evening, Marcus found himself addressing a packed auditorium at a regional conference on civil rights. As he stood behind the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, he felt a surge of gratitude. These were people who cared deeply about making the world a better place. Teachers, students, activists, and everyday citizens united by a shared vision of fairness. Marcus began his speech by recounting the challenges of the trial, describing the moments when he doubted whether justice would prevail. But then he shifted gears, focusing on the lessons learned along the way. This journey taught me something profound, Marcus said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. It taught me that no matter how insurmountable the obstacles may seem, we must never lose sight of why we fight. Justice isn't just about winning cases. It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. It's about dismantling systems built on inequality and replacing them with structures rooted in fairness. The audience erupted into applause, but Marcus wasn't done. He went on to share practical advice, urging listeners to educate themselves, vote, and hold leaders accountable. Change doesn't happen overnight, he reminded them. It takes patience, persistence, and unwavering determination. But, most importantly, it takes community. None of us can do this alone. We need each other. His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations that continued long after the event ended. Attendees exchanged contact information, brainstorming ways to collaborate and build networks of support. For Marcus, seeing this energy unfold confirmed what he had always believed. True progress happened when people came together, pooling their strengths and resources for a common cause. Back in his hometown, Marcus decided to stay temporarily, recognizing that his presence made a difference. He rented a modest office space downtown, transforming it into a hub for legal advocacy and mentorship. Young, aspiring lawyers flocked to him, eager to learn from someone who embodied integrity and resilience. Marcus welcomed them warmly, sharing stories from his own career while encouraging them to find their unique paths. One of his mentees, a bright young woman named Tasha, particularly stood out. She reminded Marcus of himself at her age, idealistic, driven, and hungry for knowledge. During one of their sessions, Tasha admitted she sometimes doubted whether she belonged in the legal field. "I hear whispers all the time," she confessed, her voice tinged with frustration. "People saying I'm too young, too inexperienced. Let's just say my background doesn't fit the mold." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Let me tell you something, Tasha. Those whispers, they're lies designed to make you question yourself. Don't listen to them. You belong here because you care about justice. And that's all that matters. Your perspective, your experiences, they bring value to the table. Never forget that." Tasha nodded, visibly moved. Over time, she grew more confident, taking on pro bono cases under Marcus's guidance. Watching her blossom filled Marcus with pride, reminding him of the importance of passing the torch to the next generation. Months turned into years, and Marcus's influence continued to grow, though he eventually returned to his practice in the city. He remained deeply connected to his roots, frequently visiting the town to check on ongoing initiatives. The legal clinic he helped establish thrived, becoming a cornerstone of the community. Carla, meanwhile, pursued further education, earning a degree in social work so she could continue advocating for those in need. Together, they proved that even the smallest victories could spark monumental change. Looking back, Marcus often reflected on the trial that had changed everything. It had tested him in ways he couldn't have imagined, forcing him to confront prejudice head-on. But it had also reaffirmed his belief in the power of perseverance and unity. Every challenge, every insult hurled his way, had strengthened his resolve. And though the road ahead remained fraught with obstacles, Marcus knew he wasn't walking it alone. On a crisp autumn morning, Marcus stepped into a classroom filled with eager students, ready to inspire another group of future changemakers. As he greeted them with a warm smile, he felt a sense of fulfillment wash over him. This was his legacy, not fame or fortune, but the knowledge that he had helped plant seeds of hope and justice. Someday those seeds would grow into mighty trees, sheltering generations to come. And in that moment, Marcus knew his work was far from finished, but neither was the promise of a brighter, fairer future.